If you are watching this after part 1 has been uploaded, please feel free to click ahead to the next video in the playlist following the bibliography portion of this video. Hello and welcome to the Conquering History channel, and welcome back if you are already a subscriber. Today is going to be part 0 of the first of hopefully many historical lecture series that I will do on this channel, this one being about the U.S. war with Mexico. So let me actually up front, before I get into more detail, talk about why I'm going to refer to it as the U.S. war with Mexico. I think that is the best way to describe the war that happened between the United States and Mexico from the years 1846 to 1848. I think Mexican-American War is an antiquated term, particularly because Mexican-American is a term often used to describe Hispanics who live in the United States, so there could be a little bit of confusion there. I also don't like the term Mexican War because it almost sounds like Mexico invaded the United States, which if anything it was quite the opposite. So I think the U.S.-Mexico War or the U.S. War with Mexico are the better terms for it. So now that we got the technical stuff out of the way, what I'm going to actually do here in this episode is not so much talk about why this will be the topic that I've chosen. I'll do that in part 1, but in here I'm going to go over the bibliography that I'm going to use when talking about the U.S. war with Mexico, so you can know what sources that I'm pulling from when I talk about things, and if you want to delve into it deeper, you can just follow the sources that I'm using. Now, I'm not going to go over all of them, but I am going to go over some particularly important ones. So, first, the book, which, as it says right on the cover, if you can only read one single book about the Mexican-American War, this is the one, and that would be A Wicked War by Amy S. Greenberg. It's just so fantastic. It's so dense, and yet at the same time it's quite short. It's less than 300 pages long, which is relatively short for a history book, but it goes into the U.S. War of Mexico with so much detail, talking about the circumstances that led up to it. There is a little bit of a focus on military battles, but what I find to be so interesting about it is it's focused on important figures during this time period on both sides of the conflict, although with a slant to the United States side. But it covers James Polk, of course, who was the president of the United States at the time, but there's also focuses on Abraham Lincoln, Henry Clay, John Adams, Nicholas Trist, John J. Hardin, who was a contemporary of Abraham Lincoln's, and Greenberg makes an argument, and it certainly is a strong one, that if John Hardin had not died in the U.S. war with Mexico, Abraham Lincoln probably would have never become president, because he would never have become the famous politician from Illinois. And there's many other contemporaries involved in there. Henry David Thoreau. It's very good. If you're just going to read one book on the U.S. war with Mexico, this is the one, and I'm going to certainly be drawing heavily upon it. Another book that I'm going to draw heavily upon is The U.S. War with Mexico by Ernesto Chavez. I actually was fortunate enough to have him as a professor of mine once. Now, this is part of the Bedford book series, which students should be pretty familiar with. They are essentially compilations of primary sources for students to study, but they usually have something written by the editor at the very beginning that gives a brief history of the conflict that's being talked about. So while A Wicked War is the one book that you should definitely read if you want to study this subject, the U.S. War with Mexico's 30 or so page introduction, where it explains what happened before, during, and after the war, is probably the most concise explanation of this war that I've ever read, and it's fantastic. So if you should definitely read it for that, if nothing else. And he gets some very good sources as well. I'm also going to draw from So Far From God, the U.S. War with Mexico, 1846 to 1848, by John S.D. Eisenhower, who, yes, I believe that he is related to the President General Eisenhower. It's also a classic in regards to studying this war. Another good source is a compilation like the Bedford series, The Dueling Eagles, reinterpreting the Mexican-U.S. War from 1846 to 1848. That's by, my apologies to their families, I'm going to mispronounce their name, Richard V. Franjavilgia and Douglas W. Richmond. which, I mean, this might sound strange, but it didn't click in my mind that both the United States and Mexico both use eagles in their national symbols until that book. So that's kind of funny. I'm also going to go into military history over the course of this. One book I'll be using is Mr. Polk's Army by Richard Bruce Winders. It just describes how the U.S. Army was composed during this war, and the differences between the professionals and the amateurs that would become part of it, and it's a different kind of look at military history because it's really expressing the experience of the men who were on the ground, not so much tactics and strategy, but what the men themselves who were fighting in these armies, or specifically the United States Army in this case, were experiencing. For the military history part, I'm gonna draw upon this fantastic military history book called War Through the Ages by Lynn Montross. It's actually a history of war, as the name says, throughout the ages, going all the way back to the Greeks, and it talks a lot about fundamentals of warfare and stuff. And it's actually one of the, probably, if not the first, one of the first history books I ever read in my life, and it's absolutely fantastic. I've never read anything that comes quite as close to it as far as quality. So I'm going to be drawing on his sections, talking about the invasion of Mexico heavily. Now we're kind of going to start getting a little bit more broad. I'm also going to use What Hath God Wrought? The Transformation of America from 1815 to 1848 by Daniel Walker Howe. This is part of the Oxford History of the United States. I haven't read all of them, but all the ones I have just been of the highest quality, and he also talks about he has a chapter dedicated to the U.S. War with Mexico. The book's kind of book-ended by looking at the end of the War of 1812, and then it goes into the U.S. War with Mexico at the end, and it's mostly about the consolidation of the United States in between and how it grew and changed during that, though, was about 30 plus years. But another excellent source that I will be using, and as I said, the Oxford book series are all fantastic. Another primary source reader that I'll be drawing on is the USMexico War, a binational reader. This is edited by Christopher Conway, and the translations are done by Gustavo Pelon, who are both editors of Spanish. So this while there are U.S. sides that are represented here, it is mostly from it gives a perspective from the Mexican side of the war, and it's also interesting because there are some documents here that look back on how the U.S. war was seen, how this invasion was seen after it happened. And I'm going to certainly be using that because at some point during this series I'm going to talk about the U.S. war in historical memory and how it is looked back on. And another one, now this might only have kind of a peripheral relation to the U.S. war with Mexico, but Race and Manifest Destiny, The Origins of American Racial Anglo-Saxonism by Reginald Horseman is extremely good. It's pretty definitive. I believe it was written in the 80s, and it hasn't really ever been replaced, and I don't anticipate it ever will be replaced. It's just so definitive when talking about, as the name says, how racial thought was a part of Manifest Destiny and how it developed. Goes a lot into the pseudoscience that was popular at the time, ideas of democracy, ideas of hierarchy of race, the races, and it's just fantastically written book. If you're studying U.S. history at all during the first half of the 19th century, I definitely recommend reading that. All right, so with that bibliography out of the way, which, as I said, if you want to see where I'm drawing my sources from, then just feel free to check any of those out. I mean, those aren't everything that I'm using, but they are certainly the ones I'm drawing heaviest on. Now, for the actual rest of this playlist, right now I'm looking at what will be an 8-part series that I'm going to make. So the first video I want to make here is going to just cover a general history of the U.S. war with Mexico. So I guess you can call that the crash course version of the U.S. war with Mexico. So it's going to be very broad. I'm going to talk about why it's important and just generally what happened, and so that you can have context for things when I go into more detail. Because I then also want to do a military history of the war, so I'm going to talk about how the armies were composed. I'm going to talk about many of the officers who were involved in the war, who would become quite famous later. People like General Lee, Hancock, Jefferson Davis, who would be really influential later in the U.S. Civil War, and of course the ones who were big generals at the time, like Scott. And I'm gonna certainly talk about their campaign south. There is some very interesting stuff. So if you're interested in military history, I'm going to definitely go over that in a lot of detail. I also want to go into detail about the politicians. That'll be another video. So like, let's say the military history will be part 2, and this might be subject to change, but part 3, I want to do the politicians of the U.S. war with Mexico. So first and foremost, that's going to be an extensive look into President Polk, because it really is his war. We're going to look at Abraham Lincoln while he was a congressman, Henry Clay, one of the basically one of the most famous American politicians who never became president, what his involvement was, a little bit into John J. Harding, who was kind of a rival of Lincoln's at the time. He was also a congressman. And a little bit into it might be its own video, but I might lump it into the politics video, the chaos that was going on in Mexico at the time, and Santa Anna coming back and things like that. So then part 4 will be probably all subject to change, all subject to order revision, but I want to do a video where I'll essentially present a paper that I once presented at a history conference about the U.S. war with Mexico and historical memory. So how is it remembered by the general population, and also how it's remembered by academics, because there's a difference between how academics have viewed the war over the last century or so, and then how it's taught in schools. So that's going to be a pretty interesting one, and I think you all are going to enjoy that. And speaking of something you guys enjoy, I'm also thinking about doing a video that I might call A Tale of 3 Battalions. So it would follow Colonel Harding and the unit that he was with until they go to the Battle of Buena Vista, where he dies, and also follow the Mormon Brigade, the Mormon Battalion, which, as the name implies, was a unit composed entirely of Mormons. So that's I've got a very interesting story behind it. And then there's, of course, the infamous San Patricio Battalion of a unit that were mostly Irish, essentially Catholics who didn't feel it was right to go to war with their fellow Catholics, so they defected to the Mexican army. There's also going to be something on the home front, so that'll look at Henry David Thoreau and the anti-war movement, and probably also the racial thought. So that's where I'm going to be drawing Reginald Hortzman's book, and then I'll have a concluding video, just sort of looking at the war again as a whole, after you, the viewer, have gotten a lot of detail over it. What did this war mean? What was it all about? What can we learn from it? And I think it'll be very interesting. I think you guys are going to like it. So please give me some feedback. I would really appreciate it on your thoughts as to how this would work. And I don't remember if I said this already, but these part 0s, I will make them for future history series, but I'm not going to go over the bibliography in the future, so these will be much shorter. And I'll actually put a timestamp below so that anybody who's watching this knows where to stop if they don't want to hear my intro and syllabus. Okay, so thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the upcoming videos.